These are the oldest stories, online at oldeststories.net. And today we're taking a break from our history narrative to look at a slightly less ancient narrative, the fantastical and fairly absurd myth of Queen Semiramis of Assyria and Babylon. I think Semiramis is one of those figures that a lot of people have vaguely heard of but don't actually know the full story on, so today's episode is that full story. Importantly, this is not an historical story. Shammu-ramat was, as we saw last episode, an historical queen of Assyria, and she probably does take the crown as the most powerful queen in Assyrian history, but that's only because the bar overall is set quite low in the category of Mesopotamian political women. How exactly Shammu-ramat came to become the Greek Semiramis is unknown. As far as we can tell in the surviving texts, she has no afterlife in later Mesopotamian legend, though at one level we assume she must have done in order to have this later Semiramis legend written, and it is pretty generally assumed that Shammu-ramat is the historical kernel around which Semiramis was later mythologized on. Now, the first mention that we know anything about was the Greek writer Ctesias of Cnidus in his book The Persica, which was written sometime around 500 BCE, a few generations after the destruction of the Babylonian Empire, and well into the Persian period, and of course many hundreds of years after Shammu-ramat, the historical figure, actually lived. Now, this book, The Persica, was apparently a history of Persia, and as such it included chapters detailing the history of the kingdoms which came before Persia. However, the writings of Ctesias are now completely lost, which is probably for the best, since he appears to have been what you could call a serial fabulist. He just seems to have sometimes made things up willy-nilly just for the fun of it. Our story then jumps forward to the closing decades of the last century BCE, because of course we can't read anything from Ctesias because his book doesn't survive in and of itself. But then about the time of Julius Caesar, there was a writer named Diodorus Siculus, and he attempted to write the entire history of the world up to that point. The work is, I'm told, it's not a terrible recounting of the various parts of Greek and Roman history, but on matters outside of his personal expertise, things can get pretty unfortunate. And Mesopotamian history is very much outside of his expertise. And so Diodorus, despite setting aside his entire second chapter or book, as it were, to Mesopotamian history, basically just openly defers to Ctesias on basically everything. Now, how much of Book 2 of this world history is Diodorus's research and opinions, and how much is Ctesias, is a question for the philologists. We're just going to basically read through it and marvel. And it should be noted before we start that both Ctesias and Diodorus were, in ancient times, criticized for their unreliability, which, in the case of this story, for anyone who's been listening to the show up until now, you'll agree that unreliable is a bit of an understatement. However, it was one of the very few works that covered Mesopotamia at all that was available for the greater part of the classical and medieval period. And as such, Diodorus' interpretation became very much a part of the intellectual landscape, especially in later eras, as his increasing antiquity made his writings ever more venerable, even if they became no less false. And this is a good lesson in why it's so important to have reliable, popular level histories for all periods. My own mother, just the night before I recorded this, called me asking me about Graham Hancock. And she was watching something on Netflix, and it looks just as reliable as any professionally produced documentary. I mean, it is a professionally produced documentary. But can you imagine if some disaster wipes out all of the history books nowadays, and then 1,000 years from now, people are left with just fragments of Graham Hancock's stuff or Zecharia Sitchin's stuff? They're going to get weird ideas, because you've all the people in the medieval times had was Diodorus and a couple other writers, and really for Mesopotamia, not much at all. It's so important that we have reliable, popular level histories for all historical periods, and that people who know their history really get out there and publicize it. Just because this stuff gets into people's heads. People make decisions based on their knowledge of history, and if your knowledge of history is the mythical Queen Semiramis ruled a giant empire in, I guess, the Bronze Age from Egypt to India, you're going to be making weird conclusions because your facts are not facts. Anyway, that's a rant. Let's get to the story. We don't really have any dates in Diodorus, but this is kind of normal for this genre of ancient histories written in the classical period. They didn't always have access to the dates, and of course, just the idea of a universal system of numbered years just wasn't something they had. Every different culture had their own dating scheme, and translating that would have been fiendishly difficult. Instead, we're told that in the very earliest ages of Asia, which, remember, for the Greeks, Asia is basically what we would call the Middle East all the way out to India. That's the extent of Asia. They don't really have a concept of it going much past that. But in the earliest ages of Asia, the kings and the people of Mesopotamia accomplished nothing at all of note. That's what Diodorus tells us. I would point out the overwhelming ignorance of this statement, which is basically the very first statement of his chapter. But if I criticize everything Diodorus says wrong in Book 2, it might genuinely take me a year's worth of episodes to get through it all. As far as Diodorus is concerned, Assyrian history starts with a fellow named Ninus. Now, that doesn't sound like anyone we've heard about in Assyrian history so far, but Diodorus seems to have known that the final capital of Assyria was Nineveh, so he assumed that the city must have been named for some legendary founder, Ninus. We don't actually know, as a matter of historical record, what the origin of Nineveh's name is. It's not actually an Assyrian or an Akkadian word. It may have come from some indigenous pre-Akkadian language, because the city is truly ancient, and it appears first in the records in the Middle Bronze Age, at which point it's already seemingly a notable city in the region. So you know what? It could have been founded by a guy named Ninus. We just don't know. But it's definitely not Diodorus's Ninus. So we don't know when this story is supposed to be, but it is before the Trojan War, so it's what we would call the Bronze Age. But in this story, Assyria is already a kingdom, as is what he is calling Babylonia, though he insists that at this point Babylon has not yet been founded. And now Ninus wants to take over the south. He's got his kingdom in what we would think of as the Assyrian heartland, and we're supposed to imagine that, Sumer and Akkad, as Babylonia, have their little kingdom, And so, as they do, the neighboring countries want to fight. So Ninus makes an alliance with the king of the Arabians, because the Assyrians by themselves, you see, they lacked enough military might to conquer any major nations. The Arabs, meanwhile, are, according to Diodorus, the most powerful army on the entire earth, but also extremely poor, and therefore quite mercenary. Meanwhile, not only the Assyrians, but also the Babylonians were super indolent, and they knew nothing at all of war. The only thing they knew was how to live in luxury. So the war was very quick. Assyria was able to take all of Mesopotamia, and then, because they were able to pay the Arab mercenaries who did all the heavy lifting for them from the plunder of Babylon, this Assyrian Arab army then conquered all of Armenia, which in fairness may have been the only Greek term available for the region of Urartu. But there is clearly a cultural memory of the Urartian conquest by Assyria in Diodorus's mind. Ninus then attacks the Medes, by which the Greek historians seem to have thought the Medes are just all of the Iranians. And from there, Ninus spent the next 17 years with his Arab mercenary armies, because remember, the Assyrian armies are just absolutely worthless. He spent the next 17 years conquering everything from the Nile in Egypt to the Indus River in India, imagining that this is somehow the natural and inevitable extent of all Asian empires. In his accounting of this great Assyrian empire, he's basically assuming that it had Persian borders, as the Greeks would have understood it. Since how could it possibly have been that the weak and inferior Persians ever managed their own independent conquests? And in other places, it seems that the peoples of Asia are just naturally subservient, and they're just hungry to pay obeisance to some mighty king. So, building an empire in this region is super easy, barely an inconvenience. But then our story really gets started, as the only remaining great powers on Ninus's borders were the people of India and the people of Bactria. Now, I shouldn't need to tell you, but obviously the historical Assyrians never got anywhere close to having borders with the Indians or Bactrians, and no nation was able to hold notable territory within the Iranian mountains in any real way until the Persians themselves. Anyway, having now conquered the whole of the known world, or at least as much as the Greeks ever seemed to care about, Ninus is now fantastically wealthy. So he sends the Arab armies home, no longer needing an army, apparently, since Asians are too docile to ever revolt. And then he set about founding the mighty city of Nineveh in his own honor. What was the capital of Assyria? Before that, who knows? Who cares? Not the Greeks. Now, to be fair, Ctesias does seem to be in absolute awe over the size and grandeur of Mesopotamian cities, and he lavishes great and not terribly plausible descriptions of their majesty. Nineveh, for example, seems to have been a city of skyscrapers, with over 1,500 towers, which were 20 stories or higher within its walls. Of course, Ctesias has no idea what he's talking about. He believes Nineveh was on the banks of the Euphrates River, not the Tigris. Though in describing the city of Nineveh as greater than Babylon, he does get the agreement of the usually far more reliable Greek geographer Strabo. And we don't actually have any direct comparison of the two cities. And so while we can be quite sure that in the late period of Mesopotamian history, both Babylon and Nineveh would have been significant metropolises, I don't actually think we can say, as a matter of historical record, for sure at least, which of the two was bigger at each of their peaks. Anyway, the empire has been established, Nineveh has been formed, we've got our borders at India and Bactria, and this is where we get to Semiramis herself. Now, Diodorus presents two main theories as to the origins of this mysterious queen. The first theory is that she was some manner of Eastern harlot who weaseled her way into the king's pants and from that vantage point overwhelmed him completely. The alternative story, which he claims is more widely accepted, is this. In Syria, there was worshipped, Syria as opposed to Assyria, there was worshipped a goddess named Atargatis, which does seem to be true, though Diodorus renders her name as Derceto. Atargatis had a fish or mermaid aspect, and the Greeks thought that Aphrodite had at one point had a spat with Atargatis, and caused her to fall madly in love with a Syrian man who lived near the coast, the Mediterranean coast. This resulted in the goddess falling pregnant, but Atargatis, upon giving birth, killed the father and left the baby exposed to the elements to die. Atargatis then threw herself into the sea in horror at her deeds, but being a goddess, she couldn't die and instead turned into a fish or some such. The baby, meanwhile, hadn't died at all, but was instead discovered by some doves, because in Greek stories, children left to die never really seemed to manage to actually die. So these doves find this baby, and they decide to make a big old nest around the baby's body, keeping her warm and feeding her like a baby bird. The semi in Semiramis is, in the Greek imagination, related to the word for dove. There is a linguistic connection there, but it seems a little bit strained. But doves, of course, have no milk, but they are very clever. And so what they did is they went to the local farms, and when the humans were away, the doves drank the milk from the cows, and then they flew back and they fed all that milk to the baby bit by bit. When the baby grew, the birds decided it was time for the baby to have some solid food, and so they changed from stealing milk to stealing cheese from the farmers. Until one day the local farmers discovered the cause of all this avian thievery, and they took the baby in. Yes, the Greeks were definitely an imaginative people. Semiramis then grew up beautiful because, of course, she was the half-daughter of a goddess, and lived peacefully in this Syrian farming town until one day the general of Assyrian King Ninus, a man named Ninus, who is equally fictional, stops by to collect taxes from the town and spots this beautiful young woman. You can probably guess what happens next. The two are quickly married, and General Ninus is completely bewitched by his wife Semiramis. But it's okay because she's a genius and she's perfect at everything, and so it's probably to Ninus's benefit that he does whatever his wife tells him. This is what we're told in the story. This isn't just me making editorial comments. This is girl boss from the time before Christ. Also, in the Greek mind, to be so controlled by and beholden to a woman, even a competent woman, was just characteristic of the effeminate Asiatics. And they had no idea that later generations would judge them for their attitudes or for their rampant homosexuality. Anyway, Greeks aside, King Ninus picks this moment to set another war against the Bactrians. He had lost previously, which is why the border had sort of stabilized there. And the Bactrians, by the way, is the Greek term for Central Asia, roughly the Afghanistan, upper northeastern Persia, and some of those Stan countries there. That's Bactria, because there would later be a Greek kingdom of Bactria, but they're just putting that name on the region the way that we would call modern Mesopotamia Iraq, just for the benefit of his audience. It's not necessarily an anachronism, though it could be. Does he think that they are one kingdom of Bactria? It's not really clear if that's what the case is. Anyway, The borders up at Bactria, he'd lost the last war, and so he wants to win this war. So he gets an army together, and it's just, a modest army, only 1,700,000 fighting men. And in fact, Diodorus goes to great lengths to try and represent this figure, 1,700,000, as accurate, which only makes the whole matter worse. He really seems to think that's a very plausible number, even though it's not. The whole tale is nonsense, though, so we can't really begrudge him a fantasy army. This army naturally includes General Ninus, but the typical story where the king catches sight of Semiramis and demands her for himself, that's sort of what you would expect at this point. Ninus goes to war, the king falls in love with his wife. That's not what we get. In fact, Semiramis was not in the war in the initial stages. You don't bring your women to the front lines. That's just dangerous and ill-advised. So instead what happens is the siege gets bogged down because the king has taken just more people than the terrain could handle. And so the king is forced to split the army, and then they were, because of this, suffering defeat in detail. Ninus then pursued a siege of all the cities and mountain passes, which brought him to a grinding stalemate. Now the war has at this point reached a standstill, so Ninus calls his wife to finally, now you can come out, it's decently safe, the front lines are stable, hang out in the general staff camp with me. And so she ventures out. It doesn't say where she was hanging out, but she ventures out to the front lines. On the way, though, Semiramis had a spark of inspiration. First, she invents a wholly new costume. This form of dress is designed both to mask her identity and make it impossible to tell men from women. And Diodorus tells us that this is the origin of the regular Persian dress in the time of the Greeks. It is anonymizing and effeminatizing. Thus attired, Semiramis was able to sneak across the battle lines into the besieged Bactrian capital. Now, she's just invented this new form of clothing, so even though it would be very common in the Persian period, it's not common now. It's totally unique. How then is she able to sneak into the Bactrian capital? Don't know. Anyway, the name of the Bactrian capital is Bactra, and so she sneaks in her clever costume, and she notes all the tactical elements of the city, keeping very detailed and precise notes. She then returns to her husband and says, "Husband, give me a contingent of the most skilled men." And her husband says, "What?" And she says, "Well, I'm very beautiful, so you should do it for me." And the general says, "Oh yes, that makes quite a bit of sense. That is how most of my arguments at my home go. So I guess I'm an Asiatic. I don't know. The Greeks wouldn't have approved of that sort of thing. But Semiramis is now in charge of a group of the most highly trained men in the army. So keeping in mind her understanding of all the tactical elements of the city of Bactra, she leads the men to climb up the side of an otherwise inaccessible mountain, and is able to thereby gain access to the undefended interior of the capital, and from there she was able to set the defenders to rout. This, of course, is a famous and proud tactic of the Assyrian kings. A lot of the time when they talk about climbing mountain fortresses, we get the impression that they were leading a small group of men across a very broken terrain get into the fortress in a way that the enemy isn't expecting. And the fact that the Greeks are mocking this usually heroic act as something that some woman probably invented, it really supports the idea that Assyrian kings might have actually been doing this. Why else would they try and downplay or mock it rather than just ignoring the claim? It seems to me more likely that Ashurnasirpal really was playing the hero, climbing up these mountain fortresses like that. Anyway, it was this military feat, as much as her beauty, that finally now attracts King Ninus to Semiramis. And so the king ordered that General Onus hand his wife over, and in grief, General Onus kills himself, and Semiramis gladly takes the upgrade. Ninus at this point then lives exactly 2 sentences after the wedding is concluded, enough time for him to conclude the conquest of Bactria, and then have a son named Ninus, and that's it. No mention is made if Semiramis was involved in his death, but many ancient commentators seem to have assumed it based on the speed of the narrative here, and of course based on the notorious perfidy of all women. And that's something else to note. It's debatable whether Greek legal rights were better or worse for women than those in Mesopotamia. Both were, from a modern vantage point, pretty poor. But it's absolutely unquestionable that the Greek literary classes in general are vastly more misogynistic than the Mesopotamian written record, taking far more opportunity to openly accuse women of all manner of vice, which is something that's largely lacking in Mesopotamian literature. Mesopotamian literature tends towards this sort of quiet neutrality on the topic of women, as if, women are just part of the world and they do their thing, whereas the Greeks seem to really just, at least some of them, just absolutely despise women. Which is, if the podcast gets to the Greek era, we'll get to that. The odds of that happening anytime soon are pretty slim. Anyway, Semiramis is queen regent because her son is newborn. So the son can't be the king, but of course you have to have the son be the next heir, because the Greeks just assumed that that's how things were done. So the first thing she does as queen regent is to survey the whole of her mighty empire, which, remember, runs from Egypt to Bactria, and then she decides to build a new and glorious capital city. And this one actually is on the Euphrates. It's the mighty city of Babylon. And note here that Diodorus is extremely fuzzy about when all this happened in history. He doesn't seem to realize that there was a separate Babylonian empire from the Assyrian one, and he seems to believe that Babylon is younger than Assyria. And this, if I had to guess, this probably reflects some kind of vague notion that Neo-Babylonia came after Neo-Assyria, as in the last couple kings of Babylon fell to the Persians, whereas the last couple kings of Assyria fell to the Babylonians. But just in general, the classical conception of history is extremely fuzzy on pretty much every aspect of Mesopotamian history and cuneiform culture, showing us very directly how much all knowledge of these ancient civilizations was dying out even 500 years after the last native king. And the Egyptians did a little bit better, though their memory only lasted a bit longer as their hieroglyphic continued to be produced a few centuries longer than cuneiform did. But it's a stark reminder that what kills a culture faster and more completely than anything else is not hardship or persecution per se, but it's the loss of the language. Now, obviously, hardship and persecution is related to loss of language in a lot of cases. But in our current age, as languages are disappearing at an unprecedented rate, so too are countless podcasts and books worth of legacy vanishing day by day. Maintaining a tiny language is a huge burden on a small and declining community. But that great weight on the community, it's the scaffold on which the whole culture sits, and when the language fades, assimilation comes soon after. And I tell you this, I lived for a long time in the Marianas Islands, where the Chamorro people are visibly losing their language, and you can see it in the generations. As the proficiency in the language falls out, so too does assimilation into wider American culture. And I mean, assimilation's not bad for itself, but the native cultures are just losing their stories, they're losing their histories. There are people trying to hold it all together, but it's a losing battle, and in a lot of cases these battles have already been lost. These histories have already been lost. These memories are being lost, and in a couple of generations, I don't know how the Chamorros are going to manage it in the Marianas Islands, but a lot of these indigenous groups, a lot of these small language groups, they won't remember anything more of their history than these sort of nonsensical tales like the tale of Semiramis that has nothing at all to do with real history. It's a real threat. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. This is a very ranty episode today, for which I apologize a little bit, but not too much. Anyway, Babylon, the Greeks all agree, is a very cool city. In Diodorus's vision of the city, which again relates very little to actual history, every segment of the walls was built by a different vassal, and the walls were massive, with a section for every day of the year. Now here's a fun fact. The Greeks of the classical period were a very fragmented people, intellectually as well as politically, and Diodorus recognizes that because of that, his various sources can't agree on whether there were 360 or 365 wall segments, because the hyper-advanced Greeks, looking down on these primitive Babylonians, couldn't agree on how many days were in the year. Do note that the Babylonians and the Assyrians and the Mesopotamians all the way down to the Sumerians were very clear that there were 365, plus a little bit extra, days in the year. And the Greeks, despite thinking themselves culturally superior to what came before, despite being 3,000 years late to the party on the whole calendar thing, appear to be confused about how many days there are in the year. Anyway, at the center of the city was the Euphrates River, running southward through the city. That is correct. 2 points to Diodorus for getting that right. Now, Semiramis did not build the wall herself. Her vassals built the wall. What she built was a central bridge which spanned the river in the middle of the city. It was built extensively from mud brick cased in bitumen for waterproofing. Bitumen is basically crude oil pulled right out of the ground and lightly processed. The bridge was broad and flanked on both shores by massive tower palaces, sunk deep into the earth, which is both the citadel for the city and a palace for the queen, and also a controlled passageway to the two sides of the city for commerce to pass through. The cherry on top, or on the bottom in this case, was that during the construction, the workers of Babylon dammed up and diverted the entire Euphrates River, and in the dry riverbed underneath the bridge, they built a tunnel of brick and bitumen connecting the two towers and expanding the palace. When the river was let to flow again, Semiramis could pass from tower to tower of her palace, either atop the river or beneath it. Now, it's a fantastical concept, and one as unmoored from reality as Harry Potter, but it does make me think, though. Could you have had an underground tunnel of brick and bitumen under the Euphrates River just with Iron Age technology? And conceptually, at least, like at first I thought, that's ridiculous. But then I thought about it a little more. Conceptually, I think there's something there. I do think that the engineering challenges, just working with bitumen-coated mud brick, would have overwhelmed a project like that. But it's not totally impossible. But it didn't exist, so it's kind of a moot point. Anyway, the opulence of the city of Babylon was unrivaled in the ancient world, and the descriptions aren't all fantastical. The walls were said to be filled with vividly painted reliefs, and the temple of Marduk, whom the Greeks call Zeus Belus, is apparently full to bursting with gold ornaments. Carvings of animals and military triumphs are in abundance. No mention is made of the god Asher, whom the Greeks seem to be totally ignorant of, but, maybe they're assuming that he's basically the same as Marduk, which, to be fair, isn't the worst assumption, especially with how much the Greeks like to syncretize gods. Anyway, the mighty hanging gardens do get a mention here, though these are not said to be the work of Semiramis, but of a later king. The hanging gardens are described as basically a ziggurat, a step pyramid type structure with water hand pumped to the top and allowed to flow down the terraced levels through a bunch of intricate canals. It's not actually a technically challenging vision, except for the scale that recalls a ziggurat more than a minor palace, and it makes the mythical hanging gardens one of the more plausible wonders of this implausibly wealthy city. Now, after Babylon was founded, it became a hub of trade for merchants from the land of the Medes, because Diodorus apparently believed Iran was the center of wealth, even in the Mesopotamian era. And with this trade, Semiramis founded many other cities. One day she took a boat up to Armenia to inspect the famous rock quarries up there at the source of the Tigris River, and she decided to have a stone cut that was about 130 feet long and 25 feet thick and vaguely phallic in shape, thus inventing the obelisk. Diodorus here is showing his ignorance, both that the obelisk comes from Egypt, not Mesopotamia, and that they were constructed, in fact, with multiple pieces, not just one giant phallic rock. And why he thinks, I don't know. Anyway, he believes that the primary driver of Babylonian wealth is their production of bitumen, which, again, that's basically surface pools of crude oil, some of which bubble from the ground, and some of which also give off sulfur so thick that it's poisonous. And he paints that up as some sort of fantastic natural wonder, but actually, surface pools of crude oil with sulfur that's somewhat toxic is an actual thing in the region, though most of the surface oil has, of course, long since been harvested by now. But in Diodorus's vision, they take all this oil and they burn it to fuel all sorts of crafts and industries, and they also use the oil as a raw input into countless materials, and from this wonder substance that fuels the economy and is part of pretty much everything that gets manufactured, apparently, from this we learn that Diodorus Siculus was actually a time traveler who really seems to be confusing ancient Babylon with modern Kuwait, as the ancient bitumen trade was highly modest and limited. It was valuable to a certain extent for a few applications like waterproofing, but it was not the center of the Babylonian economy the way that it is the center of the modern Kuwaiti economy and a huge part of the modern Iraqi economy. It's an odd mistake to make for someone who's actually from the ancient world. Anyway, Semiramis then carved the Behistun inscription, apparently, which is a real thing. It's a 100-foot tall cuneiform declaration that was actually carved by Darius of Persia, but because no one in Diodorus's time could read it, he imagines that the mighty queen had little more to say for herself than Semiramis was here, in 100-foot tall letters. From there, the queen traveled into the real land of wealth, which is, of course, the miserable Zagros interior, where she constructed a vast pleasure palace. Though she was single, she didn't want to marry, for fear that her husband would take her power. So instead, each night she would lay with an attractive fellow out of her army, and in the morning she would execute him, thus obviating the need to match the consummation with a marriage. She's then credited for building a great number of great works and founding large cities, most of which were actually Persian in origin. Though I probably don't need to remind you, the entire Iranian region was a backwater for the Assyrian kings. She then tours all of her lands again, and Diodorus goes on a baffling tangent about disagreements among the Greeks over the method by which the dead in Ethiopia were encased in glass for display. He apparently believed that generations of Ethiopian kings were perpetually on display, quite like Lenin in Red Square or something. There was just a weird technical disagreement about how they accomplished the embalming and encasing in glass. Then we finally get to her great war against India. Now, this whole matter starts when someone informs her that India was the wealthiest and most attractive land in the world. And we hear that, being a woman, she was overcome with the base desire to possess all good things in the world, even though she had no valid casus belli, and her whole war was therefore quite shameful. Such is the excess to which feminine leadership leads. When men conquer lands, it's not out of just jealousy and desire to have the most attractive and wealthy things in the world. No, it's a more noble endeavor, somehow. Anyway, in order to conquer India, she's going to need lots of soldiers and lots of boats and lots of elephants. The soldiers and the boats were got pretty easily. All it required was a tyrannical draft and a fantastical amount of wealth. But she has no elephants, for some reason. In point of fact, there were elephants in the region of the Middle East, though they were never exploited by the Mesopotamians. The idea for war elephants seems to have been developed by the Persians. It may have originally come from India, but then the Persians start using the local Near Eastern elephants as war beasts, and then it was copied by the Hellenic kingdoms. And then after a few hundred years of constant warfare, that is to say, by the time of Diodorus Siculus, the Near Eastern elephant population has gone extinct. So as far as an Assyrian king would have been concerned, yeah, they don't have any war elephants because they haven't been invented yet. But as far as Diodorus was concerned, there's just no war elephants in the Near East, because he doesn't know they all went extinct between the Assyrian period and his own era, which I think is a fantastic bit of ignorance that tells you more about its informative ignorance, I guess you could call it. Anyway, Semiramis then decides to create elephants, because she doesn't have any, by making giant frames out of reed and wood and leather, and then she sticks camels and oxen on the inside to push these artificial elephants. Now, we're told that they were so well crafted that from a distance it was impossible to tell them from real elephants. And I don't even know where to start with that one, so I'm just not going to. The war then begins with an amphibious crossing of the mighty Indus River, and it's described in thrilling detail as both sides prepared for a great clash, and then they maneuver their massive armies here and there, and he gets into the war narrative, and he has so much fun with it, despite not a word of it being true. And then the Assyrians pushed through into India, and the Indians were well on the retreat, until one day an Indian spy entered the Assyrian camp and discovered that the elephants, which had until then been held in reserve, were all fakes. This made the Indian king very brave, and he turned and he held his ground, and he sent his cavalry at the fake elephants to crush all the fake elephants and reveal the ruse, thus heartening his troops to repel the Assyrians. However, as the cavalry closed on the fake elephants, all the cavalry horses started to panic. Because within these fake elephants, remember, were camels. And untrained horses often go nuts when they smell camels. The Indian cavalry charge fell apart as all the horses panicked, and the field was carried by the armies of Semiramis. In the next round of battle, however, the Indian king used his full force of elephants, because at least he knew that the Assyrians didn't have any real elephants, so he's finally able to unleash his full strength and drive the Assyrians back across the Indus River, with Semiramis herself taking 2 major injuries in the fighting, which she apparently had been leading personally. Sometime after that defeat, she'd lost all credibility as a ruler because she'd lost a major campaign. And so her son Ninus, who is now grown into full adulthood, conspired with the court eunuchs to retake his throne from his mother. And Semiramis actually discovered this plot before it happened, but she'd received a prophecy earlier in Egypt from the Egyptian temple of Zeus Ammon, which was famous for Diodorus because Alexander the Great had gone there, but I assure you was not famous for the Assyrians. Anyway, she gets this prophecy that says you need to, when your son tries to take his throne, you need to just let it happen, otherwise terrible things are going to happen. So she didn't fight against her appointed destiny. She resigned from queenship, and she put her son on the throne, at which point Semiramis wandered out into the desert and then transformed into a dove and flew away. Ninus, the son of Semiramis, then ruled over basically the entire earth. Forget the parts that he didn't rule over, that's not important. However, Ninus had one problem. He was an Asiatic, and therefore he was naturally effeminate and indolent, and he never once stepped out of the pleasure palace for his entire life. And then, for the next 30 generations, every single king of Assyria was totally indolent. The empire was managed by eunuchs, the men and women were basically interchangeable, and the whole place was a ceaseless mess of decadence in which nothing at all was accomplished. At one point, the Assyrians did go to the Trojan War, or so our Greek historian informs us, and then finally the Persian king Arsaces toppled the whole rotten edifice, making himself king of the world. Now there were, in history, more tales of Semiramis than just this one, but those tales are either fragmentary or they're medieval, and the medieval writers take her further and further from even this source. And I have to tell you, there's no worthwhile history in this entire legend, being as it's intended to tell a true history, and yet managing to not quite hit the mark on that score. If you need a reference, I'd refer you to the 155 episodes of Mesopotamian history preceding this episode, which don't exactly recall Mesopotamian history in quite the same terms that the myth of Semiramis does. As a fantastical tale, it does have its moments. There's a fine core here for an ambitious Hollywood epic. But when we discuss the historical figure of Shammu-ramat, the fiction is both so powerfully enduring, and at the same time so rarely remembered in its details nowadays, that it did seem to be worth telling in full. Keep in mind, this is basically the history of Mesopotamia that most people were operating with in the medieval period, and a lot of the late classical period, just because They didn't have anything else. Or at least it was one of the major sources for Mesopotamian history, and it's absolute nonsense. Needless to say, the historical Shammu-ramat did none of the things that Semiramis is claimed to have done. She was the wife of a king of Assyria, but it was Shamshi-Adad V. She was unusually powerful in court in an age of many unusually powerful court figures, and she did participate publicly in governance alongside her son, again in an age when many courtiers were able to participate publicly in governance alongside the king. It's an unusual period in general, and she's an unusual figure in that unusual period. But I gotta say, sometimes she's held up as some sort of feminist icon. And if she is your personal feminist icon, I'm just going to say she's a real bad one. Her myth is frankly dripping with the typical Greek misogyny and an astonishing racist scorn for the Asiatic. And her historical origin has very little to grab onto as an alternative feminist icon. We're going to see that. We saw a little bit of it last episode. We'll see more of it next episode. Her whole story. There's just not a feminist icon, either in Shammu-ramat or in Semiramis. I don't want to dismiss the idea of important women in history. History does have plenty of women that can be celebrated. But Assyrian history, a time when gender roles were pretty universally enforced, is just not a period in which you can find any of these historical women to celebrate. I feel like the best you can get in the entire period is the goddess Ishtar, who's, got some good stories. Then there's Enheduanna, the daughter of Sargon of Akkad. And then there's Engal-Dinana, the daughter of Nabonidus. Those three, you can find something to pick at. We already looked at Enheduanna and Ishtar in very early episodes of the show. We will look at Engal-Dinana in the future. Shammu-ramat and Semiramis are just not feminist icons, and there's not a lot of women's history in ancient Mesopotamia. With that cheerful note, we'll return to our historical narrative with the very busy court of Adad-Nirari, son of Shammu-ramat. So join us next time for a tale of intrigues, an age of weak puppet kings, and a time when the taxes aren't getting paid quite as often as perhaps they should be. Also, for everyone who's still around, I do have members-only posts on ancient Egypt now, available on YouTube and Patreon. Check out the links below. You don't have to support the channel, but those of you who do, I really appreciate the support. And as always, I thank all of you for listening.